We live in an age where many of the basic rights and freedoms we always just assumed, took for granted in many ways, are now up for grabs and contested in a way that we haven't seen perhaps in my lifetime. One very dramatic example of this is there is currently a case before the American Supreme Court in which the Trump administration is challenging birthright citizenship, which we're going to learn what that is in this episode. This, to many of us, even the fact that it is being heard, feels like a sign of liberal and democratic deterioration. As with all Supreme Court cases, this kind of hinges on our understanding of history, of what particular constitutional provisions meant to those who wrote them. So, to understand what's at stake, we have to look back to what came before us. To do that, my guest today has just published a book on exactly that, the history of citizenship in America. I'm joined today by Anna O'Law. Anna, thank you for joining me.
Thanks. I'm happy to be on.
So I'm going to jump straight in at the beginning of American history and then work our way forward through to today. It's a cliche to say that America is a country of immigrants, but that is true in a quite literal sense, in that the majority of the population, or their descendants at least, are descended from waves of European immigrants, or if we want to be less polite, colonialists, who came here from what the sort of 15, 1600s onwards. I want to start with a basic question. What is the relationship of the people who were already in the country, so Native or Indigenous Americans, to the ways those colonists thought about immigration and set up immigration systems?
Okay. So
Big
I
question, I
think
know, but
no,
just to
no, no.
jump in at the start.
A lot of readers might be surprised to find Native Americans in a book that is supposed to be about voluntary migration, policy history, and legal history. So what are Native Americans doing in my book? Um, They are not migrants. They are original landowners and occupants of the land. They have a very distinct relationship to the land and to the state, colonial, and US government. They have nothing to do with migration restriction. They have everything to do with migration recruitment. So, beginning in the colonial period into the 19th century, first colonial governments, and then early American states, and then the US federal government is using what they call public land to recruit migrants, European migrants from overseas. But the public land was often land and property that was coerced from or stolen or forcibly taken from Native Americans. And what we see in the United States migration history is, of course, Native Americans are not migrants, but they are sometimes forced migrants and what we think of refugees today because the US government deported violently 80,000 people in the 1830s. So let me go back to your colonial question of so that is the relationship that there were people here who owned the land and the colonial governments and the American governments after them used that native land that was contested to recruit more European settlers.
So they, the earliest wave of colonists, I guess you could say, wanted immigration. They wanted more, at least European immigration, and taking native land through one means or another was a way of incentivizing that.
Correct. I mean, the I start with the first chapter after the introduction is the colonial chapter. And there's a myth in American immigration history that before the federal government took over immigration controls, that it was open borders and anyone who wanted to come could just show up. But the colonial chapter is there to show that the this area was never open immigration. There are huge uh, systems of colonial laws in place that restrict who can come in, but also recruit. And the recruitment side, I mean, they're giving colonies are giving away free land. They're offering free and easy naturalization. And all of this because in the colonial period, the colonies desperately need warm European bodies to work the land into yeah, to produce goods and crops and to sustain the colonies and also to send back to England. So there's a huge in that the colonies are each put in charge of recruiting their own migrants, and they desperately need warm bodies, not just to work the land and to occupy the land, but to fight off Native Americans who are contesting that land because they live there.
Could you perhaps draw, I'm just thinking of this now, a very inexact analogy to something like European colonization in Africa, in that sort of once the empires wound down, you had governments like, I don't know, Rhodesia or something, that were very aggressively trying to recruit white Europeans to come over, but would have felt quite differently about incorporating non-white Europeans into the citizen body. They wanted people there, but they wanted a specific type of people there. Or I
Ah,
guess
yes.
Israel, perhaps you could say, as another example, wants to recruit people to come, but not everyone, certainly.
Right. And you see that logic in a back, as far as the colonial era migration laws, where yes, they want warm bodies, but not just anyone. What does open borders even mean when enslaved Africans are imported? I mean, presumably the
Hmm.
borders are open to them. They want enslaved people. They don't want poor people. They don't want disabled people. This is well before the 1930s, where the US, there are government systems for safety net systems, right? Think of unemployment insurance, disability, none of that exists. And so the colonies and the early American states don't want poor people, disabled people, sickly people. And the colonies desperately need women because they want these colonists to form families, and you can't really do that without women. So
We'll come back to enslaved persons in a moment. On the subject of poor people, one thing I confess I didn't know is when it comes to indentured servants, I had a sort of crime and punishment model in my head. You know, in Dickens, there is all sorts of people who get shipped off for crimes and so on. One thing I learned is it was also sort of a much more voluntary thing in that the cost of getting a sort of, I guess you could say, ship ticket or whatever over to America was quite high. And people would often sign a contract to be a indentured servant for a set amount of time in order to sort of pay that off. I thought that was fascinating, and I sort of my head automatically went to all sorts of modern parallels. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
before I began researching this book, I understood indentured servitude like you. I thought it was a labor system, right? This is an apprenticeship system that begins in England and it is transported to the United States. But what I realized is indentured servitude is also a migration system. Most people in England do not have the money. It constituted to go to the British North American colonies or even the Caribbean colonies was almost an entire year of salary. Who can afford that? So intrepid people in England said, okay, you know what? I can't afford it. So, but I have no economic opportunities here. So why don't I gamble? And I will sign away my freedom, usually around 6 to 7 years. Um, and understanding that I get the chance of trying it out in the new world. So someone else will pay my passage to the colonies, and I owe them my labor. until I can pay it off. And so indentured servitude is a system, yes, it is a system of compelled labor and unfreedom, but it's a limited time, right, that somebody is unfree. And it is the fact that indentured servants all had contracts, paper contracts, stipulating the number of years that they owe someone their labor, protected them in a way because it meant their unfreedom was finite. For enslaved Africans, there was no contract. So they were enslaved for life, as was their offspring. So there's a huge distinction there. But yeah, I had not thought of indentured servants as someone who would voluntarily sign away their temporarily, but voluntarily sign away their freedom.
It really did remind me, and this is again an inexact parallel, of the types of sort of like holding periods we're making migrants go through in the UK and a lot of European countries, where it's a case of people wanting to come and of us needing the labour, and of course not as severe and rights restrictive as I'm sure indentured servitude was back then, but nonetheless, the way we've sort of reconciled needing people's labour with our xenophobia essentially is to have an extended period where someone has to live with reduced rights, reduced security, often in many visa routes bonded to a particular employer. So if they lose that job, then they lose their ability to be there, often paying, in the UK case particularly, almost effectively double the rate of taxes, and insecure, constantly having to renew that visa. And it strikes me as a similar sort of Faustian bargain. And actually, in the UK, we're in the process of extending that such that it was 5 years in that period, and now for most people it's going to be 15. And the more I've been a critic of that policy, I should say, but the more I've thought about it, it's not just like an economic thing of like, is that, the sort of maximally beneficial relationship? I don't think it is. It's also, it feels like we're sort of creating a modern servant caste along a similar logic of people who are coming because we need their labor, but we're going to make them live an extended period with as a sort of reduced social standing, rights, security, and so on. I couldn't help but draw that analogy now that I've learnt that indentured servitude was often a voluntary thing for poorer people who were sort of selling their labor, as it were.
I think you're right to draw that analogy. And one of the things that became clear to me I thought I was going to write a book only about migration, about people coming and going and staying. And what I quickly realized is I need to learn the history of US citizenship as well. Because what you're talking about is not just groups of people coming and going and staying. It is groups of people who arrive under distinct legal categories, thereby shaping the access to rights that they have. So, using Hannah Arendt, writing in the 20th century, her definition of rights, what a citizenship was the right to have rights. Now, what's interesting about indentured servants is, yes, they went through a period of hard labor, harsh treatment. Many didn't survive because they died and succumbed to diseases and to bad treatment. But in theory, at least, there is no ban against naturalizing a white person. After they became free, and they had fulfilled their contract, in theory, they could naturalize and become a full US or a colonial British citizen. Do we have numbers on this? We do not. I don't know how you would track it back to the colonial period. I mean, I suppose you could come up with estimates about how many people actually survived their period of servitude to become citizens.
It does. I really feel the modern parallel of like you're in this visa route. We need your labor. You want to sell your labor, but we're gonna like essentially put you through the ringer first before we give you full rights.
If you survive, then maybe we'll think about, giving you full rights. Yeah.
Now, we've mentioned several times, of course, enslaved persons who did not have even that option. Could you talk a bit about what the relationship, or I guess lack thereof, between enslaved persons and citizenship was? And also, what was the situation with respect to freedom of movement for enslaved persons? Because I know there were quite a lot of like internal deals between states about returning escaped slaves, or even regulations on the movement of freed slaves.
So the mobility of enslaved people are highly restricted because they are considered property. And in from a legal standpoint, purely from a legal standpoint, their case is easy. They have no rights because they are not people. One neat trick to the disinvesting people of rights is just say they're not people, they're property.
Hmm.
The more complicated question is what to do with free Black people, of which there were many. What is their legal citizenship status? And so before the 14th Amendment and the Civil War, the legal citizenship of free Black people is completely unclear, which means that their rights to mobility and to stay where they wanted was also restricted, even though they were free Black people. Their citizenship was unclear because some free states would say, yes, 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 we claim this person as a state citizen of Massachusetts or Connecticut. But other states did not and gave them no rights. And then what's the relationship of state citizenship to federal citizenship? None of that is clear until the 14th Amendment, which means discrimination of all kinds directed not just against enslaved free people, but free Black people was common.
One of the interesting things about, America, well, with Americans, we can often be a bit American and dual national, by the way. We can often be a bit American centric and sort of see how we practiced slavery as kind of a universal. And it's not that other people didn't, but there are some features of American slavery that are pretty unusual in a world historic context. And one of them is we never really worked out a sort of clear legal and social regime for what to do with freed slaves. Like, if you go to, for one thing, we didn't free slaves anywhere near as frequently as, say, South American slavery or Islamic slavery or classical slavery. And all of those systems had a kind of middle caste of like, here is what it looks like as a sort of, and it would be somewhere in between, a sort of quasi-free person. The Romans would literally just call it a freed man as opposed to a free man. Um, in Islamic slavery, there was a sort of specific caste depending on your exact parentage and the heritability. Whereas in the US, we kind of just never worked that out. And it was something we were a bit hostile to, is most slave regimes, however vicious, had some sort of, like with the indentured servant thing, although not contracted or bounded at all, some sort of pathway back in, if not for the freed slave, perhaps for their descendants. But Americans always just left that question sort of in a murky hanging. And we just didn't think about that, probably because of American racism.
There were ways that enslaved people could become free. They could be manumitted by their enslavers. They could, I think it was Denmark, BC, who bought his own freedom because he won a lottery. So there are all sorts of ways that enslaved Black people could become free. The problem was that although there were pathways to becoming unenslaved, the legal system and the political system did not define what rights free Black people had.
Right,
And
exactly.
The bigger problem is that anyone with Black skin was presumed to be enslaved. The burden was on Black Americans to show and to prove to any white person that might ask, to show them proof or explain to them how they became free and why they are not a runaway.
Hmm. The other big difference, of course, which will become crucial for the birthright citizenship, is heritability. The children of indentured servants would not be indentured servants, but the children of slaves would be slaves. And indeed, America has an unusually aggressive heritability system in that all that matters is the mother's enslaved status, which even other slave systems didn't necessarily have. That was another key thing, right?
That was a huge distinction. The that that heritability aspect of enslavement, that all the children of an enslaved woman would automatically be enslaved for life, that is a uniquely American invention. It begins with a law in colonial Virginia, and it is spread to other slave colonies. And so, when I teach classes about the racial construction of and the meanings of race and belonging, I tell my students African Americans were not enslaved because it was inevitable. No, the people passed laws to make them second class non-citizens. And this is one very vicious way that enslaved people are set apart, and also, very frankly, incentivizing the sexual assault of enslaved women.
Absolutely. I've spent a bit of time on slavery in the ancient world, and one thing I pointed out, and look, whenever people have owned slaves, they have sexually assaulted those slaves. That's a constant. But the heritability laws the US ended up passing would have been quite shocking, even to slave owners in other regimes, in that you had people say Thomas Jefferson is an example of this, right, who enslaved their own children because that's how strong the heritability was. Like Jefferson's children with Sally Hemings were born as slaves, whereas a biblical patriarch or an ancient Near Eastern patriarch might have children with an enslaved woman and they would inherit his status. So, like a Babylonian might look at Thomas Jefferson and say, why is this powerful patriarch enslaving his own children? That doesn't make any sense to me. That is true in Roman law to a degree, but it's unusual even for modern slave systems. It wasn't the case in um, South American slavery. That is a US thing that's very much shaped our history.
It's a US thing, and it's not even a British thing or a thing from England. It is a US thing. And so it's shocking to think about, wait, so people weren't just automatically enslaved because they're Black? No, no, no. There were many laws, and that is one of them, that made people locked in a racial hereditary caste system of slavery, and their children.
And you even got to the point where someone might be majority white in terms of their heritage, but that matrilineal slave descent, I believe Sally Hemings was only a quarter black. Um, she was actually Jefferson's wife's sister-in-law, which shows you how things were going down there. So the children of that marriage would have only been an eighth or a quarter um, African in terms of descent, but it didn't matter. They were still enslaved. Um, just a really, it's just such a perverse system that you would enslave your own children, but that was something that was normalized for a lot of the American South.
It was very perverse, but and it's also, think of the other thing that's very American, I believe, is you've read more about slave systems around the world than I have. But the one drop rule
Yeah.
The quantum rules in America, one drop of African American blood makes you black. That's some powerful blood.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, and I mean, it's not as if to say when you look at South American systems that these were not heavily racist and had racial castes, but I think we took it to another level in many ways. Which to bring it forward a bit, it is, we I think can think about birthright citizenship as a freestanding principle, but it comes at a specific historic moment, which is us, at least sort of nominally, ending slavery in the US. Talk more about that, because obviously it's related to these issues of heritability and so on. Why is birthright citizenship something that comes in as we decide to end slavery?
So as after the Civil War, and because I should emphasize, and I want to emphasize and underscore, Lincoln and the Republicans did not decide to bestow legal citizenship on Black people out of the goodness of their hearts. It was African
No.
Americans from the colonial period relentlessly advocating for their own citizenship, for their own humanity. Why did it happen in 1868? The Civil War had ended. Lincoln and the Republicans did not, they realized that in order to guard against a rollback of rights for African Americans in the formerly slave states, they need to give African Americans clear legal citizenship. Because up till that point, yes, enslaved people were not citizens, but the status, the legal citizenship of free Black people wasn't clear either, thus leading to discrimination. So the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship is very broad in its inclusion. It says all persons born on
Right.
US soil with three narrow exceptions. And what they're trying to do, what the framers of the 14th Amendment are trying to do is address that long legacy of racial slavery and caste. And that's why they went broad instead of narrow. And they made very clear US citizenship stands above state citizenship.
So why not just say all former slaves are now citizens and their children are? Why say all persons? Because you've got, I mean, not to say I disagree with it, obviously, but it seems like they're solving a domestic problem in a way that's then going to have massive implications for immigration. They could have just said everyone already here is a citizen, including slaves, and left it at that, but they said all persons.
They were worried about the status of the children of undocumented Europeans. Are we
Mm,
going to
okay.
leave them as stateless people? What if the parents of European immigrants were undocumented or unauthorized? So are their children, well, what's their legal status? They wanted to go broad. And the today, we have different groups that the Trump administration does not like. But back then, the most hated group were Chinese immigrants who were
Mm,
arriving on the West Coast in large numbers in the 1850s. And there was a heated debate with the passage of the Birthright Citizenship, 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment about voting rights. And it went something like, surely you don't mean that those hated, reviled Chinese immigrants, if they give birth, their children are citizens. And the framers said, no, we mean them too. We mean them too. We can't go so narrow, carving out groups here and there. I mean, what if we what there are undocumented European immigrants here? What are we're going to make their children stateless? We have to go broad.
dumb question, perhaps. Why a constitutional amendment? Why not just pass a law?
Good question. So the framers of the 14th Amendment went through the trouble of the Article 5 amendment procedure to add that birthright citizenship to the Constitution. It was already in the 1866 Civil Rights Act, but the framers said we need to put it in the Constitution through the Article 5 amendment procedure to make sure that this provision is not overturned by a future Congress, that this provision is not interpreted as by a future Supreme Court as a you know unconstitutional reading of Dred Scott. We want to put it out of reach of regular politics. And so the idea of Trump coming along and saying he's going to change the Constitution with an executive order, that is not a thing.
Let me try an argument out on you, but this is, I don't know, something I think about more on the political philosophy side. So it's a bit of a truism to say that freedom and slavery are antonyms, as in that they're kind of, the opposite of each other. And historically, there is a relationship between the emergence of freedom as a concept and slave systems. I think thinking about that history does give us grounds to add in additional elements to our conception of freedom. So we'd say slavery, the classic definition we go with is ownership, which is certainly a core part of slavery, is one person owning another. And so freedom is like not being owned, not having anyone with that power over you. Cool, that's fine as far as it goes. But there's also other elements to slavery. For instance, the disrespect and the humiliation of the slave is often a core part of the experience. The dishonoring of the slave. And one core part is heritability. All slave systems have some sort of conception of the heritability of slave status. And that, to me, makes me think we need to think about freedom in those terms as well. Like the heritability, like part of being free is the heritability of that status. Part of being a free person is being secure in not just your rights, but that your children have those rights. And I don't think we necessarily conventionally think about it in those terms at all, but thinking about the history does, to me at least, make me think that having birthright citizenship is an important part of our personal freedom and an important part of being in a free state. As someone who knows the history more than me, would that argument sort of make sense to you?
It does make sense because if you look at a case about the ability of US born children of undocumented people to attend public schools, 1980 something, Plyler versus Doe. The state of Texas wanted to ban US citizen born children of undocumented people from attending public school. And the majority opinion said, the whole point of birthright citizenship is we are trying to avoid a permanent caste of people who can
Yep.
never access rights, who can never access a basic public education, which would severely limit their earning potential and their ability to be exploited. So it is birthright citizenship is, and the framers of the Constitution talked about we need to avoid creating a permanent caste. What is the opposite of creating a permanent caste? Being generous by saying all
Yep.
persons born on this land are citizens. Well, the other thing about citizenship is, that got me thinking in this project is what is in the package of rights called citizenship? Yes, yes, yes. The right to vote, the right to run for public office and serve jury duty and testify in court. What else is in there? And so, what I found in my research is the freedom of mobility and the right to set roots where you want. Those
Yep.
are core citizenship rights, but they were undefined for large groups of people before the Birthright Citizenship Amendment.
And if you, sorry, I feel like I'm bringing some particular wheelhouses of mine to this, but just things that my head has been stuck in recently, is I think what people don't realize is that when you allow that creation of, as you said, and I think it's a really great phrase, a permanent caste, that is not just an unfreedom for them. That unfreedom is going to bleed out into everybody else because people form friendships, they form relationships, they have children together. And we're seeing this in the UK immigration debate right now, where it's like, oh, people are going to be here 15 years in this sort of permanently lower caste. What if they have children with a British citizen? And apparently the government's answer is we will deport them too, you know? And so now, you know, it's not just that the freedom of this lower caste is restricted. It's that my freedom as a citizen to sort of marry who I choose, have children with who I choose, and do so secure in my expectations, that's now been diminished as well. And it'll just bleed into everything. And I don't think people think about it like that at all.
So the example I give about the embeddedness of undocumented people and immigrants in US society that I give to my students and in talks is I said, why should you, if you are a US citizen, care about whether undocumented people have rights and what immigration policy looks like? I said, here's one example. If your local law enforcement has signed a 287G agreement with the federal government saying they will cooperate with US immigration enforcement. And if your local law enforcement is asking people for their immigration status, what immigrants are going to go contact the police? Say you or a loved one was the victim of a violent crime and the only eyewitness is an undocumented person. Do you want that person to
Mm.
come forward and cooperate with the police to help catch the people who victimized you? Or are they going to be too scared? And so your one eyewitness to a violent crime won't come forward or has fled. There are ramifications and rippling effects to all persons in the United States if there is a caste of people that do not have access to rights, basic due process rights.
One of the things that frustrates me is it seems like we're living in an age where we are seeing quite profoundly the liabilities of nativist logic, the harms that can come from letting that ideology loose with the reins of power. I would really like to see centre-left parties, to a degree the Democrats, certainly European centre-left parties, just making the sort of case that we've just made. Certainly there are economic benefits to immigration, but also just making the social case. Like this is a world that's more free in this respect is better for all of us, and they just seem so scared to ever do that, and it really like is a source of frustration for me. Like they just stand for something, you know?
It's the Democratic Party in the United States has been in a defensive crouch for
Yeah.
I don't know how many decades. And like you, I would like to see a full-throated endorsement of immigration and why immigration is good. One quick example more. If undocumented people and legal immigrants are afraid to go to the hospital because ICE is doing raids on hospitals, um, and they're afraid to go get vaccines for diseases, what do you think is going to happen in the rest of the population? This is the the Democratic Party has, you know, inexplicably trying to go after those crossover voters. I have no idea why they're doing that when they should be shoring up and turning out their own voters. And because they've been so terrible on immigration, this is one of the things that I think that potential Democratic voters have that the last election stayed home because they were just couldn't tell the difference between them and the Republicans.
And I could paint you, however bad the Democrats are, I could paint you an even bleaker picture of the UK Labour Party on this issue. Anyway, back to our main story. What have been the main challenges to birthright citizenship from its ratification as a constitutional amendment through to today? It's one of the big cases has been the children of Chinese migrants, right?
The Wong Kim Ark case in the 1890s
Yeah, that was the
was,
one I was going for. Could you tell us a bit about
yes.
that?
So there was a case raised by it was Wong Kim Ark was a Chinese immigrant. Under US immigration and naturalization law, he could not naturalize because until 1952, not 1852, 1952, Asian people could not naturalize under US immigration law because it was restricted to all white persons. So Wong Kim Ark, as an immigrant who was legally authorized to be in the US to work, he had a child born in the United States, and that child went to China on a trip, came back, was excluded in San Francisco, and the immigration authorities said he's not a citizen. And so that became culminated in a Supreme Court case in which this is the same Supreme Court that decided the segregation case Plessy versus Ferguson. So we're not really talking a racially enlightened court.
We're not
But
talking the
even
wokes here.
they, yeah, that's the Plessy versus Ferguson court. Even they in Wong Kim Ark said, well, you know what? Plain language of the 14th Amendment says all persons born in the United States, and the child of Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States. And so, regardless of his parents' immigration status, he is, in fact, a US citizen. Wong Kim Ark has been, birthright citizenship has been um, in multiple challenges has always been upheld until now. There is this Trump v. Barbara challenge, which Trump will not win. But the fact that it's even showing up as a Supreme Court case is deeply disturbing.
Do you think we'll get a dissent?
We are going to get a dissent, at least one. It should be 9-0. It actually should not even have been granted cert. It should have
So
been, this is
before
so
we jump into
clear.
that
Yeah.
case, could you just give us a quick outline of it?
Okay, so Trump v. Barbara is a combination of a number of cases of a number of entities that are challenging the constitutionality of Trump trying to revise birthright citizenship and thus part of the Constitution with an executive order. He issued an executive order saying that it would be proactive that from a certain date that children born to someone who is undocumented would not automatically be a US citizen. He claimed all sorts of historical precedent, which political or legal that are wrong. And so Trump v. Barbara, which we just heard oral argument on April 1st, no joke, is the case that is before the Supreme Court where they're deciding the constitutionality of Trump's executive order rescinding birthright citizenship.
So, what argument are they making? As I'm following this, there's this phrase in the amendment subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and they're trying to read a whole bunch of stuff into that. What are they trying to read into that, and why is that, to use your words, wrong?
So the Trump administration and the Department of Justice and Solicitor General Sowers in his oral argument are saying, Well, the children of undocumented people are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, therefore they should not be US citizens. This makes, I mean, it on so many levels, but it's nonsense on stilts. It's historically wrong. There were people, if you're talking about temporary immigrants or unauthorized, undocumented people, yeah, they thought of that back during the 14th Amendment. When Congress shut down the international slave trade in 1808, there were still hundreds of ships coming in smuggling enslaved Africans. Those are undocumented people. Did the 14th Amendment intend to cover them? Yes. So there were undocumented people. And the idea that undocumented people or their children are not subject to the jurisdiction of the laws can, if an undocumented person today committed a crime, they are still subject to the jurisdiction of US laws. You cannot commit a murder and say, oh, haha, I'm
Not like you have
undocumented.
diplomatic immunity or something.
That's right. You can't touch me. So the other thing that the Trump tried to do, and Solicitor General Sowers, is to use federal Indian law and to say, well, Native Americans are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and therefore they and their children are not automatically US citizens. Ha ha! Applying federal Indian law, there's a reason it's called federal Indian law. It's about Native Americans. Applying federal Indian law to immigrants is I don't know, it's like comparing apples to a dinosaur. It's a strange application of law when Native Americans have a very distinct sui generis relationship to the land and to the US government. And more to the point, federal Indian law scholars have written amicus briefs saying that's not what they meant with subject to the jurisdiction, and it should not be applied to the children of undocumented migrants.
There's just a bullshit element to this, isn't it? And it's not unique to this case, where, like, look, the US Constitution is famously short and famously in need of interpretation, right? It's not like some European states where you've got like this massive book of like every subclause, right? So there's always going to be like judgment calls in there, but it seems like there's an element, particularly within the modern right, it's been there for a bit, but it's growing more and more and more and more. That just if you views it as just like sort of like a little game, a little challenge. You start with what you want to justify, and then it's almost just like a little college essay. What's the best bits of history you could pull out to try and make sense of this? As and you see that with like so many things where they're just sort of they start with where they want to get to, and then they just fart out whatever can be best made to fit that. And all the more gallingly do so with this sort of po-faced insistence that, oh, it's original intent and what the founders meant. And like, at least liberals are honest with a sort of, I don't know, what does it get called? Living constitutionalism, that we are being a bit creative with this thing. But it seems like there's just sort of a massive hypocrisy of like this very po-faced, no, no, only the written word, and then really just making it up on the fly with a lot of the challenges that we've seen.
A lot of what passes for constitutional interpretation these days is what you said. Um, yes, the US Constitution is the shortest constitution among the world's constitutions, except, yeah, there are parts of it that are unclear. The notoriously clear as mud Ninth Amendment, nobody knows what it means. But the 14th Amendment, Section 1 on birthright citizenship, the words mean what they say. The problem, as you point out, with this quote unquote original interpretation of the Constitution. You can do a faithful originalism reading of the 14th Amendment. This is not what Trump and his supporters are doing. It is very easy to cherry pick um, historical data points, and it's very easy to do bad historical analysis. I mean, if you want a primer on how to do it correctly and all the shoddy things being done, Jonathan Janap's case against originalism recent book is really eye-opening on the hidden moves that conservatives are making to get to, like you said, to get to the result, the legal result that they want.
It honestly seems like a lot of the time it's just what can we get people to go along with? What's going to embarrass them too much? Can I ask, just while I've got you here, can I ask your opinion? It's not strictly related, but it is within the Reconstruction Amendments, the insurrection clause, because that seems, to me at least, another time where we just sort of went, yeah, it would seem to say this thing, but we don't like that, so we're not going to do it. And that was a case where it looks like the birthright citizenship thing is going to lose. Maybe more closely than it should, but it's going to lose. Whereas it seemed like with the insurrection clause that there was just no political appetite from all but like a minority within the Democratic Party to even attempt to enforce the plain meaning of that. And I will grant the plain meaning of that is not unproblematic. Like it does kind of leave it hanging on what do you do when you is this just going to be like state by state making this decision in the same way a state wouldn't put someone who was 29 on the ballot for president? But nonetheless, that is what the text says. And it just seemed like we're in a space where like it really is just what the political will is at the moment, and there was no political will to even attempt that one. Or I don't know. I don't know what you think of how that whole debate played out.
I think you're right to underscore that Supreme Court opinions in the United States, as I tell my students frequently, this is about power. This is about who
Yeah.
has the supermajority on the court. This is not about some politically insulated science of doctrinal interpretation. This is raw power. So Mark Graber wrote a recent book about the history and the meaning and the original intent of the insurrection clause. And the history is pretty clear that it would apply in this case. And as you said, the Supreme Court just decided to set that aside. So I think one thing I'd like to leave readers with is this is about power. This is not about just law.
Yeah, and even with the exercise of power, power can work with certain internal logic, certain internal constraints, and even power that feels the need to dress itself up a bit, even only for propaganda purposes, could be better than just fuck you power. And it seems like we're increasingly just descending into fuck you power because we
We
can.
seem to be going that way, yes, because of the not just the majority, but a supermajority on the Supreme Court. I mean, what is notable is the lower courts. In the lower courts, Trump has lost more than 4,200 times on all immigration challenges. 4,200 times.
What would you make of an argument that Trump I mean, and again, I think this would just have to be a counter assertion of power on our side. Trump is just an illegitimate president per 43. I don't know, whatever the insurrection clause is. And when we retake power, there is an argument for just saying all of this is void.
There is, I support a rebalancing of the Supreme Court, which is adding members to the court
Yeah,
because I believe it is just not just me. The public opinion believes that body is illegitimate.
you'd go full. I mean, I agree with you. You'd go as soon as we can, just add 5, 7 more people.
Right. because that's a easier, that's it would it wouldn't be, it's not nothing, but it's an easier lift than putting term limits in, which would require a constitutional amendment. And so I think the if the Democrats manage to get the White House and two branches of Congress, they need to do this. Whether they have the appetite for it, that's a different question.
I think they will need to be pressured and bullied and primaried to have the appetite for it. I think that will
Correct.
be the Democratic primary electorate is more radical now than the Democratic Party, I think, on these sorts of issues. They'll go for that, whereas a lot of Democratic politicians, to be fair, have said they'll support court packing. I worry a bit about the, oh, well, what if we did like this term limits thing and like it seems to me like that, as you say, one would require a constitutional amendment. Two wouldn't fix the underlying problem within a generation or so. So it's like doubly useless. I'm not quite sure why they're defaulting to that I think possibly just because it sounds less radical, but I don't know why they're going to that as opposed to packing.
Now, the other thing they can do if they don't have the appetite for packing is to institute and Congress can pass some very serious reforms of the Supreme Court that applies to the Supreme ethics reforms. Why is the rest of the judicial branch bound by ethics laws that the Supreme Court is not? About disclosing who they take money from and gifts and all this stuff. I mean, that would be a intermediate step of exposing the corrupt influences and the moneyed interest on the Supreme Court.
Yep, yep. Yeah, I mean, I this is another thing of mine. I get a bit frustrated with a sort of we are in a very radical place right now where a lot of constitutional rights that we take for granted are just dissolving before our eyes. We are going to need to be quite radical to get back to something like a functioning liberal democracy. And I think the problem with the Democratic Party is not universal. Like a lot of the people who've come in and been elected, both on the left and the center, since Trump, a lot of the people who got elected for the first time in this last decade are pretty good. But it's the leadership who've been there since like the 70s and have just learnt this wholly different way of doing politics. I think just have like an instinctive aversion to anything that sounds too procedurally radical, and that kind of will just have to be beaten out of them.
It's going, it would be faster and easier to halt the slide into authoritarianism if we had a robust opposition party. Since we do not,
Yeah,
it's going to be a little bit slower for Democratic voters to vote out in primary one by one the people who are feckless.
it would just be so much easier if we didn't have to do that. And I'm not even talking about being radically left wing or anything. The guy who just won in Hungary is like centrist, centre right, but he's been like, okay, we're arresting people for corruption, we're closing these. He's been procedurally aggressive, and that's sort of what I want to see from the Dem. Even I'm a progressive. I would prefer a progressive. I want to see that procedural aggression from people I vote for.
Hopefully, somebody in the United States got the message from what happened in Hungary. Hopefully, we'll
Yeah.
see.
Let me end with a philosophical question. We've had this mythos about American separation of powers and American federalism that power will check power, that the Supreme Court, Congress, the president being separated will kind of like check each other, that having a federal system where power is diffuse will mean that we can't ever have like an American dictator. Doesn't seem to have worked, does it, in the last generation?
It worked pretty well for a while. Federalist 10, ambition will be made to counteract ambition. The framers anticipated someone like Trump. What they did not anticipate was political parties and the effect of political parties and the circling of wagons of political parties to protect their own prerogatives.
Hmm.
and having and to be able to lose sight of the national interest and the public good.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think the US system needs to be overhauled very fundamentally.
Hmm.
How we do that and whether we do that in my lifetime, I don't know. I
Hmm.
hope that we get it done in my students' lifetime.
Hmm. Oh, and I cut you off about your projection for this case. Obviously, we've heard, as of we're recording right now, we've heard all arguments, but I assume we're still a way away from a decision. Um,
The decision will come probably in mid to late June,
okay.
is my guess.
Any estimates based on sort of the questions that have been asked? Rejection,
Should
but
be
with a
9 to
dissent?
0, but it might be is it 8 to 2, 8 1 or 7 to 2? 7 to 2 is worst case scenario from me, talking to okay, put it this way, for immigration lawyers, of which I'm not one, they think this is an easy case. If they said if we cannot win this one, all is lost.
I guess one of the things I've continually said to people over many years of doing this podcast is when I hear something like that, an alarm goes off into my head of like, okay, but what if it is that bad? They did take the case, didn't they? There's someone on the court who has some appetite for this.
There, someone on the court has an appetite. I mean, four people had to vote for a grant of certiorari. So four people had an appetite for this. Their motivations for accepting the case, we don't know, and we may never know. But I, at the very least, I hope that we as a nation have a national discussion of what we mean by citizenship and why that birthright citizenship clause is there. And maybe rethink giving people rights based on legal citizenship since it can be so easily taken away.
One thing I do worry about is say it's like 7-2. Um, the dissents, I think, will then sort of provide a bit of a scaffolding for them to come back next time. I worry that if it's 7-2, we'll go, oh, see, there's nothing to worry about. Whereas, in fact, there's quite a lot to worry about. I also wonder if we might get one of those opinions where it's like, not this time. But if you wanted to give this another go, here's the arguments I'd use. Like they keep doing that, don't they? Sort of like say, maybe not this case, but we might go for something a bit like halfway, or like here's what you could come back to us with. I worry they might say no, but leave the door open a bit. And then everyone takes that as like, okay, we don't need to worry, whereas actually you need to worry a lot. I could very easily see something like that happening.
No, it could happen. The United States has been always a very ambivalent about being a multiracial democracy. And those questions about who is a citizen and who has rights are timeless. And they continue and persist because, as you point out, the losers will not give up.
Hmm.
But that means that the rest of us need to be vigilant
Hmm.
and to not let up either.
Yep, let's end it with that. Thank you so much for coming on. Just to close, is there anywhere you'd like to direct the audience to your book, anywhere to follow you online, anything like that?
I'm on Blue Sky under the handle Unlawful Entries,
Mhm.
and you can order my book and read a author's Q&A at my website, annaolaw.com. If you've bought my book, I'm happy to send you an autographed bookplate sticker, and you can request a sticker there.
Cool. Thanks so much for your time, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me on.